Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, West Asia Under Fire. Very sorry to be delayed today. We had some technical issues that we've addressed now. So my name is Corrina Mullin, and I will be I will be moderating today's discussion. And very excited to have three excellent guests with us today from the U.S. Peace Council. I will just start with a brief introduction and then I will introduce our amazing panelists. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which time zone you may be in. And welcome, as I said, to today's webinar, West Asia Under Fire. Thank you for joining us for this critical discussion at a time when the region is facing one of the most aggressive and multi-layered imperialist assaults in recent history. From relentless military bombardments, forced starvation, mass displacement, to economic siege and ideological warfare. All of this is a response, at least in my opinion, to the irreversible transformations that are underway on a world scale and due to the inevitable decline of US and Western, more broadly, Western imperialism and the rise of a multipolar world order that is already beginning despite its tortured birth, is already beginning to create space for the unfinished business of decolonization and national liberation. So today we'll unpack how this context of imperialism, of settler colonialism, that is fueling the genocide, political and economic destabilization, and humanitarian catastrophe across West Asia. Just in the past 24 hours, the Zionist entity has intensified its bombardment of Gaza while maintaining a blockade that has pushed the enclave to the brink of wide-scale famine. The IOF that's killed just 63 people, including a journalist, in the last 24 hours. The IOF killed 10 people trying to access aid from a distribution center operated by the U.S. Zionist-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation as part of the attempt to replace UNRWA and weaponize food aid. The UN World Food Program confirmed that at least 4 people were killed trying to access food in Deir al-Balah. The Red Cross Field Hospital in Al-Mawasi came under fire, causing panic, multiple injuries. A majority of Gaza's 38 hospitals are out of service. Over the course of the last 19 months of genocide, entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble. Whole families have been wiped off the face of the earth. Every university in Gaza has been destroyed. Al-Auda Hospital, one of the last functioning medical centers, is under threat of evacuation, and over 64% of cancer medications are now unavailable. So the targeting of hospitals, aid seekers, children, has become normalized in a war that now uses starvation as its primary weapon. And we're all familiar now with the range of sides that have been used to describe what's happening in Gaza: genocide, ecocide, culturicide, herbicide, scholasticide. All of this is systematic destruction that's executed by the Zionist entity with full military, economic, and political backing from the US. Yet the world remains largely inactive in the face of this genocide, despite, condemnations by some Western powers, but, especially the US, we know, and even those states that are now speaking out way too little and too late, we know they continue to arm and diplomatically support the violence, and they are absolutely responsible. And the U.S., this is very much the U.S.'s genocide as it is Israel's. But Gaza is not alone. There's growing worldwide movement in solidarity with Palestinian liberation and with regional liberation more broadly. Of course, Yemen stands out. It continues to stand with the Palestinian people by enforcing anti-genocide measures, including a maritime blockade on weapons shipments to Israel, despite facing Israeli strikes and recently that have twice targeted Sana'a airport. Yemen has vowed to continue its anti-genocide actions. In Lebanon, Zionist imperialist aggression escalates because of the solidarity the Lebanese people have provided to Palestine, the Palestinian liberation struggle, and of course, especially the role of Hezbollah as part of the axis of resistance. So, they're trying to, the Zionist imperialist assault is trying to block construction equipment, targeting bakeries, mobile homes, aid convoys in the south. The Lebanese state is paralyzed under internal and external pressures, and it's blocked aid from Iran and Iraq. Reconstruction efforts are actively thwarted, especially as the U.S. pressures Gulf states to withhold assistance until Hezbollah disarms, which is an impossible demand under Zionist occupation and constant attack. In Syria, we know the Zionist imperialist regime change that sought to undermine the country's role in supporting Palestinian liberation as a member of the axis of resistance. The country is now balkanized, fragmented into zones of foreign control, its economy strangled still by sanctions and military occupation. But the Syrian people will no doubt, and they continue to fight back despite the fact that daily life is marked by sectarian violence, kidnappings, surveillance, and fear. We can't discount ongoing and future resistance. And then, of course, Iran, after decades of imperialist assault, genocidal sanctions, covert and overt sabotage, psychological warfare, Iran targeted for asserting its own sovereignty and supporting the Palestinian national liberation struggle and regional liberation more broadly. Iran's nuclear program is framed as a global threat, but as we know, the core issue is Iran's sovereignty and energy independence, and the U.S. has repeatedly broken its agreements, most notably Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA, and making trust nearly impossible from the Iranian side. And Iran will not compromise on its dignity and its sovereignty and its support for Palestinian liberation. So what we are witnessing across West Asia is not a collection of isolated crises, but an interlinked system of control, an attempt to stabilize the core accumulation here in the imperialist core in the face of the crisis of imperialism and capitalism. So this conversation today is not just about documenting those realities, it's about challenging them and understanding the deeper structures that allow this violence to persist and the forces that are resisting this violence. So thank you again for being here, and let's begin. I will introduce each of the speakers, and then I'll introduce each one at a time, and then we'll move into 15-minute presentations, and then we will have time for question and answer following the presentations. So we'll start with Ajamu Baraka, who is a geopolitical analyst, organizer, writer, human rights defender, and veteran of the U.S. Black Liberation Movement with over 53 years of work in the U.S. and internationally. Currently, Baraka is the founder of the Black Alliance for Peace and chair of its coordinating committee. Baraka was a candidate for vice president of the United States on the Green Party ticket in 2016. He currently serves on the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council and the leadership body of the United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC, and steering committee of the National Black is Back Coalition. He is an editor and contributing columnist for the Black Agenda Report and recipient of the Corrina Award for Uncompromised Integrity in Journalism. In 2019, Baraka was awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial's Peace Prize. I'll introduce the other speakers as well, and then we'll move into Ajamu's talk. Bahman Azad is the president of the U.S. Peace Council, a member of the Secretariat of the World Peace Council, and a representative of the World Peace Council at the UN. He is also a member of the Administrative Committee of the UN Anti-War Coalition, UNAC. Dan Kovalik is the author of numerous books, including The Case for Palestine, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care, and the forthcoming Syria Anatomy of Regime Change. He has been a labor and human rights lawyer since graduating from Columbia Law School in 1993. He served as an in-house counsel for the United Steelworkers for 26 years. He has represented plaintiffs in human rights cases arising out of the egregious human rights abuses in Colombia. He also taught international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law from 2012 to 2023. He received the David Mills Mentoring Fellowship from Stanford Law School, the Sharina Shim Award for Uncompromised Integrity in Journalism, and Iran's 15th Farabi International Award. He is on the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council. So without further ado, we'll start with Ajamu Baraka's presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Corrina. This is a very important event, of course, and a task and a responsibility we all take very seriously, especially at this critical moment. And we want to, again, apologize for the technical challenges. Think that we have overcome those. Well, we have other challenges. One is related to myself specifically. We had a slightly different order of the speakers, and we were going to have myself speak last, but that's all right. But the problem we have, or the challenge, and we're going to overcome it, is that in the process of getting prepared these last few minutes, and I'm sure all of us have faced this from time to time, my notes that I had for this presentation somehow has disappeared from my computer. So we're going to nevertheless go forward. It may not be 15 minutes or 12 to 15 minutes, but we're going to at least comment on what we see as the critical issues that are facing us at this moment. Issues that connected not only to the plight of Palestinians and the mass slaughter taking place in Palestine, but the issues that the other two our colleagues are going to speak to related to Iran and related to the region as a whole. I just had an opportunity to return from to visit Iran about a week and a half ago. I got back maybe 2 weeks ago, um, and I want to start there before we talk about the what was assigned to me, which was to talk a little bit about the Palestinian situation and connect that to the region. One of the things that I've was very much aware of, and it was reinforced in conversations with ordinary Iranians during the short period that I was in Iran, was a real as a question as to why is it that for more than 40 years they appear to continue to be in the crosshairs of U.S. destabilization and outright assault. What they ask has been their crime, besides wanting to live in peace, wanting to have the freedom to engage in their own processes, wanting to have their nation respected as equals, wanting to have and be able to exercise independence and national sovereignty. And it's a question, but more so it was a rhetorical question because they understood that these are very sophisticated people, that what makes them a target is their fierce determination to be independent and their unswerving commitment to the cause of Palestine and its Palestinian people, and their opposition to the machinations on the part of the Israeli state and the U.S. operating with and through that particular state. So they understand the conditions that they face. They understand why they're in the crosshairs, but they also communicated a very important message also, and that is that they're not prepared, as Corrina said a few minutes ago, they're not prepared to surrender their independence or their national dignity. And so while they want to live in peace, they are determined to do what they need to do to defend themselves. And I think, and I thought that was very important. The other issue that we discussed quite extensively was at that moment, sort of the beginning of the negotiation or new talks, if you will, between the Iranian state and the U.S. regarding the issue of their nuclear program. Um, and the question that emerged, and I'm sure that Dan and uh, 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 Comrade Bahman will address this, is if the baseline of the agreement for the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action as related to the nuclear question was around the issue of enrichment, around the issues of being able to verify the agreement, but yet, uh, in light of the objective fact that that agreement was in place, that the International Atomic Energy Agency was able to monitor and to verify that there was no alterations, no violations of the agreement in terms of the commitment to enrich uranium up to 3.67. It was clear that the Iranians were attempting to and were addressing and abiding by all of the terms of the agreement. But yet, the agreement, the treaty, was still abrogated by the Trump administration. So one wonders if the issue is just the issue of nuclear energy, then what is the basis of the conversation? Well, one of the things that we knew that happened when the agreement was abrogated by the Trump administration was that the concerns expressed by the U.S. state went beyond the nuclear question and was related to the questions around the Iranian attempts to be in a position to be able to defend their sovereignty. It was connected to issues of Iran's um, uh, uh, right to determine its national associations, its political agreements with various forces. It went to political questions beyond the nuclear question. So one wonders then what is going to be the basis if the objective is really the nuclear question in and of itself. But it's quite clear that that's not really the real issue. And so many people are wondering if this new series of negotiations or conversations is more so just a pretext for providing the conditions for a more aggressive response from the U.S. But my colleagues will get into that, I think, in more detail. One of the things that we want to talk about is how all of these issues interconnect in the region. We say that West Asia is on fire, and of course, many people know that when we refer to West Asia, we're referring to the colonialist term of the so-called Middle East. This has been a region that's been on fire for quite some time because of the critical role that it plays in terms of energy, in terms of its geographical location, etc. But it appears that this the this region is even more critical today because of the shifts in the balances of power, the correlations of power in the world today, and the deepening crisis that the U.S. and the Western nations are facing and attempting to try to maintain the relationships and the power configurations that have been in place since 1945. And as a consequence of these shifts, and what appears to be almost a cluelessness on the part of Western nations, they have embarked on a strategy of military first, attempting to maintain hegemony through the use of militarism. And the consequences have been the entire region facing destabilization, and attempts on the part of the U.S. to try to address these issues of the military shift of power by inserting itself even more aggressively, uh, threatening all of the states in the region, allowing the Israelis to engage in a wholesale genocide to advance the notion of a greater Israel, with the consequences that we have seen almost on a daily basis. The issue of Palestine then becomes the front and center in the crisis of the so-called Middle East or West Asia. West Asia being on fire because of the ability of Israel to pursue its policies, its interests that will align itself with the U.S., but interests also that appear to not always be in alignment with the longer term interests of the U.S. And that's something that we want to talk about. There tends to be a somewhat simplistic, in my opinion, notion that Israel only operates as a vassal of the U.S. And we know that there is alignment in interest, but it appears that with the shifts in power, with the new configurations developing globally and specifically in the so-called Middle East, that the longer term interests of the U.S. And Israel may not always be in alignment. We can see from the latest trip from the Trump administration that into the Middle East, that it appears that there are elements in the foreign policy community that see the strengthening and expansion of the relationships between the U.S. And the Gulf states is becoming as critical, perhaps maybe even more critical than the ongoing relationship between the U.S. and Israel. And we can see that as a consequence of some concerns in Israel itself, that there appears to be some movements or moves being made by the Israelis that are not always in concert with the interests of the U.S. The situation with Gaza and the expansion of Israel into the Golan Heights, into southern Lebanon, all are in alignment with some of the more longer term interests of the U.S. But the pursuit of a greater Israel um, that is undermining the U.S.'s relationships with these Gulf states is becoming a critical issue for the U.S. But the bottom line here, though, beyond the regional and global geopolitics, is the human component. The fact that no matter what these interests are that are shifting, what we see is that there are real live human beings caught in the middle. And we're referring to, of course, the Palestinians that have suffered tremendously since 1948, Palestinians that are now being subjected to the most horrific uh, uh, mass execution, uh, if you will, since the Second Imperialist War or the World War II, with the full support, complicity of European powers, and the undermining or inability of all of the institutions that have been put in place since the Second World War that were supposed to be connected to or committed to upholding international humanitarian law and international human rights, being rendered basically ineffective. Um, and so we are being subjected to this horrific scenes of Israeli aggression, Israeli brutality, where hospitals, schools have been targeted, where Palestinians are being gruesome scenes where Palestinians are being burnt to death, where the population is being moved from place to place, seeking out so-called safe zones that never really existed, and a situation that no one who's honest can conclude that what we're saying is nothing more than a genocide. It's important that we are reminded and we remind all of the viewers of this webinar that this is a situation that is it cries out for a more effective response from the global community. The fact that the International Court of Justice is still involved in making an assessment around whether or not there's a genocide, to many of us is obscene. Uh, the fact that while there have been two critical indictments rendered by the International Criminal Court against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister, many of us believe this is not enough. This is not enough to reverse the kind of impunity that the Israelis have experienced up to this point. It is a situation that demands that we respond as a international community, but it demands a response from those of us who are part of the anti-war, anti-imperialist communities also. So, this situation we see raises certain critical and strategic questions for us. With West Asia on fire, with the ongoing genocide in Palestine, what does that mean for us in terms of what should be the response from the anti-war, anti-imperialist communities? And specifically, what might that mean for those of us who are part of the U.S. Peace Council? And I think that that's the few comments I want to make as I close out. That, that at this critical moment, and we see that in the U.S., for example, in order to be able to continue this aggressive stance it has committed itself to with its military first strategy, that when you look at the expenditures of the U.S. government, its budget, and the budgetary process that we know we are involved in right now, we see that the cost of further militarism and war policies are being shifted to the U.S. population. That the commitment to maintain the Trump tax cuts has translated into shifting resources away from the needs of the people to the military. In the U.S. Peace Council, we have recognized that and have organized a campaign, a Move the Money campaign, a campaign that's raising this contradiction, that is attempting to mobilize opposition to the fact that the austerity is an austerity that is meant to provide the resources to allow for the U.S. oligarchy to continue its aggressive policies abroad. And so that is a critical framing that we know needs to take place. The other point that we need to raise is that with this militarism, there are structures that the U.S. population needs to be aware of that's facilitating the ability of the U.S. state to project power internationally. It's a global basing system with bases around the world to the tune of more than 800 to 1,000, depending how one defines bases, and the costs that are associated with that. And that is one of the reasons why the U.S. Peace Council took the lead in organizing a coalition to close U.S. bases. It then went further and put in place a coalition to close and address U.S. and NATO bases. Those two coalitions we are moving very forthrightly to revive those coalitions at this critical moment, because they are needed more today than even a few years ago. And thirdly, we have to be honest. We have to be clear with the population that we can't sugarcoat this moment. People have to understand that these policies are a reflection of an oligarchy that is divided, an oligarchy that some recognize that the maintenance of global hegemony is beyond the cost of the U.S., but an oligarchy in which another faction believes that maintaining global U.S. hegemony must be done at all costs, even at a cost to the population in the U.S. So we have to be clear about what the moment reflects, that we have to build more effective organized resistance, that we have to understand that taking a forthright anti-imperialist position is a absolute necessity, that we cannot allow ourselves to be manipulated into notions of a benevolent empire that will intervene into various states in order to uh, uh, uphold human rights, to express their humanitarian concerns. We have an opportunity with the exposure of the true character of Western imperialism as the consequence of Gaza to reverse that approach, to undermine their use of any kind of soft power to advance their interests. But it means we have to be absolutely clear in our language and in our analysis. We have to talk about imperialism. We have to suggest to our friends that are concerned about war, that are pro-peace, that because of the material basis of imperialism, that a commitment to peace has to begin to be shifted to a real commitment against imperialism. So these are some of the tasks that we believe that this moment provides, some of the responsibilities that we have to adhere to, not only to advance and protect the interests of the Palestinian liberation movement, uh, but to protect and advance the interests of global humanity, because it's quite clear that the number one threat to global humanity at this moment in history resides or emanates from the United States of America and its allies. So our responsibility is to be clear. It is to be clear and to be committed and to never let anyone suggest to us that, as difficult as the conditions are, that we cannot organize ourselves and reverse the situation and advance ourselves collectively. So these are my few comments. We have more that we could talk about as we go through this discussion today. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that enlightening and powerful talk, Ajamu. And despite me throwing you in the deep end by having you go first, thank you so much. That was a really excellent opening discussion in the sense of laying this sort of providing the context, the broad sort of historical context, really empirically rich, and also this historic depth that you've provided, and reminder, that West Asia has been on fire, that Western imperialism has set West Asia on fire for several decades now, and I think also reminding us of the importance of an organized anti-imperialist, anti-war movement. And thank you also for giving us the background on U.S. Peace Council's work and contributions to building that resistance. So thank you so much for that. We'll now move into Dan Kovalik's presentation. Thank you, and apologies, Dan, for the confusion in the lineup as well.
No worries. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. Yeah, so I want to talk a bit about Syria today, which I think it's fair to say Syria over the last, I guess, 15 years or so has been one of the most divisive issues amongst the left. A lot of the left was supportive of what they believed to be a revolutionary movement in Syria against the government of Bashar al-Assad. And then others I believe, well, certainly I can only, if I speak for myself, but I think I can speak for the rest of the panel. Others of us believed that it was not a revolution, that this was a terrorist war brought from the outside into Syria, and that if Assad fell, um, it would be a disaster for the Syrian people and the Syrian nation. The Syrian nation could not exist really under those circumstances where essentially terrorist groups would take over the country. Well, it is not with any relish that I have to say, announce that the what we feared would happen has happened. The terrorist group of HTS, which was really nothing but a rebranded Al Qaeda. The leader, Al Jilani, was the head of Al Qaeda. At another time, he was the head of ISIS. Up till recently, he had a $10 million bounty on his head from the U.S. for terrorism. Has taken over Syria. And not in a popular revolution. This was essentially a coup organized by the West, which used these Al Qaeda forces. By the way, a third of them are foreign fighters, non Syrians from all over the world. In fact, at one point, the ambassador from Syria to the UN said that they had collected passports amongst the foreign fighters from 101 different countries. Can you imagine that? 101 different countries. This was a world war against Syria. And Syria finally lost that war. And now Al Qaeda's in charge, and they're doing exactly what we feared. They're murdering minority groups, especially the Alawite community. If you don't know, Alawites are practice a form of Islam, a very permissive one. The women don't cover their heads. They drink alcohol. Do not build mosques. They have this kind of personal relationship with God. It's actually very beautiful type of religion. Well, the Alawites are being persecuted by the new government, who have murdered whole families, driven at least 30,000 Alawites into Lebanon. They've driven 100,000 Shia into Lebanon, driven Christians into Lebanon and elsewhere. And the multi-ethnic state that existed in Syria for millennia is gone. And again, this is something that those of us who had been to Syria, as I had been twice before, and then I've been there now recently since the HTS took over. This is exactly what we feared. And this is what much of the population feared as well. I mean, that doesn't mean everyone loved Assad. And it doesn't mean people didn't have legitimate critiques of Assad. But everyone knew, or a lot of us knew, that what would come in is worse. Much worse. And I think that we're seeing that writ large now. And I'll just tell you, I met with when I was in Syria now recently, I was there at the end of January. And I met with the Syrian Catholic Archbishop in Damascus, who was very kind to give me an interview. He actually told me it was the last interview he was giving. It for his own security. He was giving no more interviews. But because I was a nice guy, he said, I'll give you one last one. And he said three things that to me were very profound, in a short way described the problem, the issue. First of all, he said, we used to live under a dictatorship. He says, now we live under something worse, a leadership by these extremists. And as a Christian, a member of the Christian minorities in Syria, of course, he was worried and is worried what the future of Christianity even is in Syria. And by the way, and I mean, just so you understand, because I mean, a lot of people, they don't remember even Christians don't remember how important Syria is to the the history of Christianity, right? St. Paul was Saul until he rode to Damascus, the capital of Syria, and he was converted. And there is a church to St. Paul there. St. Paul walked the streets of Syria. The head of St. John the Baptizer is still in Syria, or at least it was till recently. I'm not certain, given the new government, if it still is, but it was housed actually, I believe, even in a mosque, which shows the historical pluralism of this society, where different religions live together. And one person told me, I met this woman, wonderful woman. She was a journalist. She was captured by Al Qaeda in 2012, I think, and she was liberated by the Syrian armed forces at that time. And I didn't even know what religion she was. I mean, why would I? I didn't ask her. And she didn't tell me. And I recently found out she was an Alawite. And she told me, she said, Dan, we don't, she says, yeah, I am an Alawite, but first of all, I'm a Syrian. Like, we don't go around telling people, or at least historically, we didn't go around telling people what our religion is or asking people what their religion was. We didn't care. And that's all changed now, right? Because you now have this group that, by the way, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency had said in 2012, and you can find this document online, that Al Qaeda, that the West was supporting, and the DIA says the West was supporting it back then, wanted to set up a caliphate, a religious caliphate in Syria. Well, that's what they've done. Okay. So the first point of the bishop, he says, we lived under dictatorship, now we live under something worse, a government by extremists. The other thing he said was, he echoed what I just said in terms of this was not a revolution, he said. I mean, he wanted to make that clear. This was not a revolution that overthrew Assad. This was a band of terrorists who took over by force. And that's what it was. It was not a popular uprising. And again, he said a third of their forces are not even from Syria. And to the extent there's Syrians involved, almost all of them are from the northwest province of Idlib, so they don't even represent the rest of Syria. He goes, they don't represent us. This is not a Syrian government. This is a foreign government. And in fact, aside from Gilani, almost every other top official now is from Turkey. And Turkey has a huge role now in the government because they were so key in the Western attempt to overthrow Assad. I mean, they were one of the key players, amongst many. And then the final thing he said was, the U.S. brought these people here, they can take them. Okay? Again, reiterating, these guys didn't come here from, they didn't grow up from the roots of Syria. They were brought here. And in fact, al-Jilani himself, while his family is from Syria, that is true, he himself, I believe, grew up in Saudi Arabia, if I'm not mistaken. And he ended up, how he got to Syria was that he ended up being a foreign fighter with ISIS in Iraq, right? ISIS sprung up in Iraq after the U.S. overthrew Saddam Hussein. And he was arrested by the U.S. military and imprisoned because he was committing acts of, aggression, whatever you call them, against the U.S. military in Iraq. Well, one day he just waltzed out of the prison and into Syria and began leading ISIS and then Al Qaeda against Assad. I mean, he clearly is an asset of the U.S. He clearly was let go and trained to do what he did. And, lest anyone have any doubts, Donald Trump, when he was in Riyadh, just shook hands with Gilani a guy who was, a designated terrorist not long ago. I mean, I'm talking weeks ago, and says we're now going to normalize relations with Syria. All is well now, as far as the U.S. and Europe's concerned, because Al Qaeda is in charge. Can you believe it? I mean, this is Orwellian stuff, right? You can't even satirize this. It satirizes itself. And by the way, then you look, and then I'll finish here. Keep an eye on Burkina Faso, where they have a revolutionary leader now. And who's trying to overthrow him? Al Qaeda. The same people we're now recognizing in Syria. Al Qaeda they are our foot soldiers in our imperialist wars. I'll end with this. If you haven't read it, you should read Seymour Hersh's piece from 2007 that was in the New Yorker magazine. Okay, it wasn't in Workers' World newspaper. It was in the New Yorker magazine, in which he laid out how, I believe after 2005, while the Bush administration had, after 9/11, 2001, do you remember that? Had been focusing, at least to some extent, on fighting Al Qaeda, that they started a redirection in 2005, and Hersh's article is called The Redirection. They started supporting Al Qaeda and like groups to go after countries like Syria and Iran. And that was written in 2007. And so what happens in 2011? All of a sudden, you have these terrorist groups sprouting up in Syria, claiming to be revolutionaries fighting Assad. But what happened again? Hersh had already foreshadowed, and many of us would go on to foreshadow the terrible things that we're seeing today. So, as the Who song goes, we won't be fooled again. I'd like to believe that, but a lot of people seem to be fooled. We get fooled into the next war. Everyone opposes the last war. No one. It's very few oppose the war that's happening now because they can't see it for what it is. And I think, you have to look for these patterns. That's it. Okay, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Dan. Yeah, and it reminds me of a tweet I saw recently, which said something like, one day we all will have recognized that this was wrong, how wrong this was, or something along those lines. And you're absolutely right. It's, so unfortunately, so many people are lacking the courage and the backbone, to call out the genocide and and oppose and resist the imperialist war now as it's happening. And I really appreciate the context, the political and economic context that you've provided us on Syria, and especially a sort of political economy of sectarianism as a sort of, key tool today of U.S. imperialism. And it's really important to understand it in that context, and as connected to the regime change and what in Syria and the awful ramifications, especially for religious minorities, not to mention, for Palestine and what it means in terms of Israeli, Zionist expansionism as well. So thank you for that. Okay, let's move on to our final panelist, Bahman Azad. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Corrina. Glad to be here and learned a lot from the two speakers. I would try to be brief as the time has passed, and I prefer to have a lively discussion and question-answer period. So I just cover what is more urgent at the moment now. Comrade Ajamu gave the background to the whole situation with Iran. And we all know that Iran is playing a key role both internationally and at the regional level with regard to the transition to the multinational world. And as a result, it is a target both for Middle East region reasons and for global reasons, is one of the main targets of the United States, as it has been for the past 40 years, 45 years. Let us take a look at the situation as it is. it is clear that Iran has become a main subject right now for the United States for several reasons. Globally, we know that the US has lost the economic competition with China, diplomatic competition with China and the global South, and is unable to compete on those levels. We know that. Even some of the leaders of the United States already have accepted that loss. The second is the wave that started with the entry of the Russian forces, special forces into Ukraine, and the defeat that the United States imperialism has been facing with, that they are almost recognizing that they have lost that battle. What made the whole situation critical for them was the October 7 uprising in Palestine and the battle that discredited Israel, kind of torpedoed its invincibility and question and put under question its legitimacy as a claim on its claim to be the victim here. So the image of Israel as a victim is also gone. And what the events that followed in the Middle East, it brought the whole situation to a point that the U.S. was losing. U.S. and Israel were losing the battle in the Middle East. So what was the alternative? How could they restore that? With the extreme brutality that they showed, both of them, Israel and the United States, toward Palestinians, and then the attacks on Lebanon, on Syria, just to maintain that hegemony. Otherwise, the loss of Middle East would have been loss of the whole global front, given the strategic significance of the Middle East in terms of resources and in terms of its closeness to Russia and possibly as a part of the Chinese plan for like the Silk Road or north-south corridor from Russia to India through Iran and all that. So they knew that they had to save the Middle East from collapse and falling out of their hand. And in doing so, they had to resort, and they had no choice, in my view, from imperialist point of view, no choice that resort to most brutal, unhuman weapon and tools to maintain their hegemony. Now, after causing damages to the Palestinian movement and to the Hezbollah, now is Iran's turn to put an end to the whole process of resistance in the Middle East. The reason, I'm sure a lot of a good significant part of US ruling class still holds the same position as Israel, that the war is the only solution to the situation of Iran, to the Iranian situation, and as a result, they are pushing for that. But the reason that the United States and Trump administration are sitting at the negotiation table, because they think now that they have overthrown Bashar al-Assad government in Syria, now that they have caused a lot of damage to Palestinians and the Lebanese and all that, now they can win through negotiations, some concessions from Iran or retreat from Iran. And the question is not just a nuclear issue, as Comrade Ajamu also mentioned. It is non-issue. It has been non-issue from the beginning. It has been an excuse. The objective is totally disarm Iran and through it the resistance movement in the Middle East. And the whole nuclear issue is important for the US because Iran's enrichment up to 60% puts it on the verge of being able to nuclearize its defense system. Not that Iran is intending to, but since it is at the gate, it forces the US to try the least expensive way, which is negotiations, to be able to disarm Iran. And they are not going to limit themselves to only 3.5% enrichment. They want Iran to ship out all the enriched uranium from its territory to some third country. They want to shut down all the centrifuges. They want to not only limit to that, but as U.S. leaders said, I think Rubio said today or yesterday, that the question is Iranian missiles, Iran's support for the resistance movement, Iran's defense policy, independence, and everything else. So what U.S. wants is totally 180 degrees opposed to what Iran is seeking in these negotiations. And the chances that these negotiations, barring Iran's total submission to the demands of the United States, is not going to go anywhere, in my view. Or even if they come up with some kind of a temporary agreement one way or another, it is not going to last, because the continued policies of Iran in terms of resistance, the military capabilities of Iran, as it has achieved so far, if they are not dismantled, the conflict is going to continue. And as a result, one way or another, in my view, the chance of war still looms over our heads and cannot be eliminated until a lot of factors in the US, as Ajamu mentioned, and throughout the world change. And I'll stop here and I don't drag it on further, just to leave it open for discussion. So I'm sure there are a lot of questions about this.
Thank you so much for that very powerful talk as well, Bahman. Really important points raised, and thank you also for bringing it back to the comments that we started out with from Comrade Ajamu about the role of Iran. That the targeting of Iran is not about the nuclear issue. It's a pretext for disarming Iran. And that has to do with Iran's very crucial role in resistance in the region, resistance to U.S. imperialism and support for Palestinian national liberation and liberation in the region more broadly. And so this is a huge issue that, of course, the anti-war, the peace movement needs to confront from an anti-imperialist perspective in order to really grasp at its roots, what's at the heart of this violence and what needs to be done to stop it. So thank you all for those really fantastic contributions. And I know we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'm going to remind everyone now, if they have questions for the panelists, please post them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom screen. I will read out the questions that we have. Maybe we'll go one by one, and I'm sure there will be more that come in the meantime. I also have a few questions myself, so if there's time, I may ask them as well. So our first question, let's see, a side issue perhaps is the weakening oversight of U.S. nuclear sites, warheads, plutonium pits, etc. I don't understand much of this, but clearly people in the U.S., particularly the Southwest, are in danger. Would anyone like to talk about the context of security around nuclear sites in the U.S.? And, I suppose also connected to the broader context of austerity and the defunding of public institutions, deregulation, and also, thinking about the U.S. and the need to completely dismantle the U.S. War machine. What does that entail as well? Maybe that's a question we could sort of open up to the panelists if anyone would like to answer.
Well, I could begin very briefly. I think it's important for us to keep something in mind. While those are very real concerns we have in the Southwest and other parts of the country, let us be reminded that under the Obama administration, there was a proposal that was accepted to upgrade the U.S. nuclear facilities to the tune of $1 trillion. And a number of the points made in the question were raised as justifications or why that money was being rationalized to in fact do that. Instead of moving toward dismantling the nuclear facilities and continuing a conversation that has started toward the reduction of the number of nuclear weapons between the U.S. And now the Russian Federation, and it could be also included at this point too, the Chinese state. So, while these are real concerns, let's keep in mind how those concerns can be manipulated into the continued theft of the public's resources in order to maintain this myth of safety with the possession of these nuclear weapons.
Great. Thank you for that, Ajamu. Bahman or Dan, would you like to respond?
No, I think Ajamu pretty much covered what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, great. We'll move on to the next question then. This one is from Gregory Gillis. In light of Western governments' refusal to in any way truly stop the Israeli genocide, despite widespread majority protests by citizens, how do we hold these governments accountable for their complicity and force them to divest, sanction, and boycott Israel and have its leaders tried for genocide and war crimes?
Well, I'll try to take that one. That's obviously the $64,000 question that all of us as activists are struggling with. I think obviously, it's a huge task at hand. It's going to be very hard to do what you said. I do think that sustained protests of the type we've seen could maybe eventually bring that result. Obviously, time is of the essence. I mean, the people of Gaza don't have any time. We know that. I think some of these direct actions, for me, hold some promise. There is another flotilla that's planning to go to Gaza, I believe, tomorrow or the day after. A high profile one, Greta Thunberg, is going to be on it, for example, who's turned out to be a real, formidable human being in my estimation. There's also going to be this march from Cairo, Egypt to the Rafah crossing in the middle of June. I guess thousands of people from around the world are going to go and protest to have the Rafah crossing open for humanitarian aid, to protest the war. You have veterans now in front of the UN building in New York who are on a hunger strike, a 40-day hunger strike over Gaza. I think all these sorts of things are valuable. You cannot guarantee anyone, is going to bring about the results that you talk about, is going to end the genocide and have people held accountable. But I think the combined weight of all these things is having an impact. I mean, the fact you have Western leaders at least saying that what's happening is unacceptable, right? Obviously, they're still arming Israel. We all know that. We all know that they don't really care about the Palestinian people, but they've been forced to express that they care about it. And that's because of the protests. And you do see some countries now starting to say they're not going to trade with Israel or send them arms. I believe Spain is one of them. Ireland is another one. So again, unfortunately, there isn't the time, again, the time pressures given what's happening to the people of Gaza, make it difficult for this to happen slowly, but it is happening slowly, and I think one can never know what acts will be, take place that will turn the tide. But the tide is starting to turn. And I mean, the truth is Israel's collapsing. I mean, it economically, socially, morally, I mean, in every way. And again, that day may come a lot sooner than one thinks. And the fact that they know they're totally isolated in the world is making a difference. Um, I remember this anecdote from someone, an Algerian, and talking about the Algerian independence struggle against the French. And she said that the French occupiers left so fast that the French soldiers that were occupying her home left the home with hot food on the table still. You don't know when that time will come in Israel. And again, all we can do is keep organizing, keep protesting. And I do think that day will come.
Thank you, Dan, for that optimism. And certainly, I agree. It's in addition to the material transformations underway, ideologically, I mean, the growing global movement in solidarity with Palestine liberation has undoubtedly challenged the hegemonic narratives, the hegemonic discourses. And, the student movement, too, has, I think, been a big part of that.
Absolutely.
Yes, yes, thank you. Thanks for that. And I guess I just wanted to follow up, and maybe Dan or Bahman or Ajamu, if you want to answer this too, because Ajamu, you also brought in the role of international law and some of the contradictions there and the limitations around it, mentioning the ICC and ICJ cases, for example. Um, so I'm wondering, does anyone want to address that? Like, is there any hope in these international law or other international institutions contributing in any way, or are they just so steeped in imperialist, with their roots in colonialism and shaped by imperialist power? Is there a possibility of international law really stepping in any formidable way?
I guess
Well, I
as a
think
lawyer, I'm happy to address that if you'd like me to.
Okay, we'll come back to Ajamu afterwards because I know Ajamu, you raised it. So,
Oh, go ahead. I didn't see Ajamu. Go ahead, Ajamu.
okay, Ajamu, do you want to
well,
speak?
no,
We'll come back to
and
you,
I
Dan.
wouldn't, and I would not attempt to try to address this in terms of the kind of depth that I know Dan has regarding this issue. But I would just say, on a superficial level, if you will, that it's important that these institutions they exist. But I think it's been quite obvious that there have been some real limitations. I think that the answer resides in what Dan alluded to a few moments ago in terms of the ability to apply popular pressure, the pressure emanating from the people themselves on these institutions to provide what we might define as justice in any kind of way. It's important, though, that it was important that the International Criminal Court did, in fact, move and indict both Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister, Gallant. Um, Many of us believe, though, that those indictments were not expansive enough. It's quite clear that if you're going to indict Netanyahu and Gallant, you need to also include, at that point, you should have included Biden and Blinken. And now with the genocide becoming a part of the Trump administration's responsibility, Trump should be indicted also. So if these institutions are going to have any kind of credibility, they have to operate with credibility. They have to operate and at least pretend to be objective, if you will. But what's also clear too, and Dan can maybe can deal with this or Bauman, is the real limitations. I mean, in particular, when you look at the International Court of Justice, the fact that we had some very, very important very important agreements that came out from the court, reminding everyone that the settlements on in the West Bank were illegal, and ordering the Israelis to begin the process of withdrawing and dismantling those settlements. That the court also said that the conditions seemed to be developing that indicated that a genocide could, in fact, be on the way, and ordered the Israelis to cease and desist, basically, in that process. Um, but those orders were basically ignored with no real consequences. And we just heard that the Israelis have been successful in getting the court to delay its final adjudication on genocide, with the accepting the appeal from the Israelis that won't be handled until January 2026. At that point, there may be no Palestinians in Gaza based on that. So, the legalistic approach, this kind of state-centric element of the human rights framework, has real limitations. And that's why it's very important for us to understand the importance of utilizing weapons like BDS in a more effective way. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks, Ajamu. Dan, did you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, obviously the ICC and ICJ have very, big limitations, as Ajamu said, and I've written whole books on how limited they are and pro-Western, etc. But they're a tool, and the fact that these warrants have been issued for Netanyahu and Golan have already paid some dividends. I mean, countries are pointing to these warrants for their decision to go after IDF soldiers who will go on vacation abroad. Those soldiers are now afraid to do that because they're afraid they're going to be tried for war crimes, right? And these countries are pointing to the ICJ and ICC for authority to say, hey, we think war crimes are being committed and you're in the IDF, so you're part of that. And in Israel, it's a rite of passage for IDF soldiers after they've completed their service to travel abroad to kind of celebrate that they've gotten through their mandatory service. Well, now they're afraid to do that. I mean, that's a big deal. And while Gallant and Netanyahu are able to travel freely throughout the West because the West will honor those warrants, many countries will. So even their travel certainly has been curtailed. And they have the danger of, passing over countries, even through their airspace that might go after them. And they think more warrants are going to come down from the ICC. So again, it's very limited, but it has implications. And I think, again, it can be used as a political tool for us as activists. Obviously, when we protest, when we write op-eds, whatever, we all point to those things. And then that's an important thing to have. It's an important thing to have that authority. And again, I think you'll see more decisions coming down against Israel. And again, I think the weight of that will have an impact. So.
Great. Excellent. Thanks, Dan. And Bahman, do you have anything to say on this one?
Not me, because those two experts spoke.
Okay, great. Well, the next one might be of interest to you. This is a question by Jack Maruz. Do you think that Iran will be able to materially support the resistance in Palestine going forward without setting off a broader regional war?
Well, good question, and at the same time, it's based on some assumptions. First of all, logistically, of course, there have been damages to the connections between these forces throughout the Middle East, but with the fall of Syria. But and I'm not aware of the methods that they use for contacts and logistical support, but I'm sure these continue because if you look at it, well, Iran did not have a land connection to Yemen, but still Yemenis are struggling. We should not forget that Hezbollah was not defeated in the last elections that we had in Lebanon. I heard that they won 107 of the 110 electoral districts, and people were cheering. Hezbollah has not been weakened in many ways, and the resistance continues. So whether this connection of the various forces in different areas would make a difference, or how much difference does it make in terms of logistical issue, I don't know. But one thing is clear, that neither Iran nor Lebanese nor Hezbollah or Yemenis or even Syrian movement have given up the struggle. So, and this struggle is a result of imperialist intervention oppression, and it's nothing that you can stop it just in the fear. If they wanted to stop, they would have stopped a long time ago instead of going forward with all the risks and threats and dangers that they're facing. So I am sure this resistance will continue, no doubt. But the assumption, the way the question is put forth, to me, it seems that it's up to Iran to decide to avoid a war or not by stopping the resistance. To me, it's based on a kind of false assumption that the war will come by the actions of Iran, which is not true. People have the right to resist, and they will resist regardless of what dangers they face. If Iran was afraid of wars, it would have stopped resisting a long time ago, which I don't think they will. The question is, will the US attack Iran if Iran continues? Will Israel start attacking Iran? If you put the question in a proper framework, then response to it and our mission, our responsibility towards it shifts from one place, from Iran to the actual culprits of this disaster that is going on in the Middle East in terms of human life. So I think we should reorient the question and ask whether US and Israel will start a war that could go out of hand. And that is something that we have to wait to see. But my feeling is that they have no other tools left for them to resist, to suppress, than the military attack or war. They cannot compete economically, diplomatically, politically. I mean, they have lost all those fronts, and the only thing left to them is the war. And we should not kind of sit down and think that a couple of negotiations or discussions will change that. I think U.S. is trying to maintain its hegemony, and at any costs, and they're going to do it. So it's up to us to resist that and stop it. Thank you.
Great, excellent, and thank you for reorienting that question. There are a bunch of questions coming in now, and I'm wondering if maybe I should group them. We have a few more on Iran, so maybe I'll bring those in right now, and then, there are some broader ones, more sort of theoretical questions, and then there's one about Yemen. So another one about Iran was, can you speak about how defending Iran and the Axis, i.e. being anti-war, is being reduced to siding with so-called terrorists, how to combat this ideological gymnastics by the imperialist propaganda? Another one, please talk about the fact that most of the people, oh wait, hold on, is that it? Yeah, I'm not sure. Is that anyone in Iran? Sorry. Yeah, is there a way to assure Americans that they can have a future beyond US imperialism? And then another one, I recently saw that the US has sent bombers and A-10s to the Middle East. Trump has told Israel not to bomb Iran. Are the negotiations just a ruse to give the US time to prepare an all-out attack on Iran? Yeah, why don't we have those, and then we'll move to the other questions.
Well, let me just jump in with the middle question. The question is not whether U.S. will have a future without imperialism, which I'm sure it will. The question is whether U.S. has a future with imperialism, and to me, that is the main question that we have to address. It is imperialism that's destroying the future. So stopping that will guarantee the future, in my view. But in terms of negotiations as a means of, tactical delay tactic to prepare for another attack on Iran, it seems to me could be in their mind, and probably they use it the same way in Ukraine. That you remember that the German chancellor said that all negotiations with Russia were just preparations for war. This could also be the case here, but there is a difference in this situation that we are dealing with the interests of Russia and China directly involved in this process. And US is not going to be just facing Iran, but probably China and Russia as well, because Iran has signed the strategic agreements with both China and Russia. And now it has become much closer than before to these countries, and they share the same mission, historical mission, it seems. So I'm not sure that US will have that free hand to push the situation toward that goal, even if they wanted to. So we have to put together all the factors that are involved, both globally and regionally, to see whether this is going to happen. But we know that the leadership and the ruling class in the United States, in the situation it is desperate enough to do anything, to hang on to any action, to avoid loss of the front globally. So it's a risky time, it's dangerous time, and we should be prepared for all of that.
Great. Thank you for that, Bahman. Yeah, I think especially that those growing military partnerships, relationships between Iran, Russia, and China are extremely important to understanding these transformations underway. And I wanted to ask, does anyone want to take on the imperialist propaganda dimension? So how do we combat the ideological gymnastics by imperialist propaganda? Dan or Ajamu?
Yeah, well, I believe part of that question, if I recall, was, countering the claim that somehow Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism and we're fighting terrorism. I mean, I think frankly, the best argument is that we are the terrorists. I mean, I think, the U.S., there's no greater act of terrorism that's happening today than in Gaza. Murdering children. What else could be worse than that? Meanwhile, as I already mentioned, the U.S. is supporting Al Qaeda in Syria. I just think that the facts speak for themselves if you know the facts, right? The facts are that the West is supporting terrorism around the world. And the truth is that when you look at countries like Iran in particular, they have been very staunch opposers of terrorism. Soleimani, who was killed by Trump, was fighting ISIS. And Iran is a mortal enemy of Al Qaeda and ISIS. That's the irony. That's why the U.S. is using those groups against Iran, right? So everything we're being told about the struggle against terrorism is the opposite of what we're being told. It really is, again, Orwellian. And I'd add more to that list, but the U.S. has knocked out every leader in the world who also were mortal enemies of Al Qaeda. And that would be Gaddafi, that would be Saddam Hussein, right? That would be Assad. I mean, why is it that after 9/11, the U.S. again started attacking all the countries that were opposed to Al Qaeda? So I think the propaganda falls apart very quickly when you just look at the facts and point out the facts. That's my view.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dan.
You
Ajamu,
know, the great Guinean revolutionary Amilcar Cabral said that we had a responsibility to tell no lies, claim no easy victories. The emphasis is on tell no lies. For those of us who are attempting to live lives of principle, who understand what it means to be a radical or a revolutionary, one cannot allow yourself to operate within the context of the terms of the enemy. You can't be concerned about what will be conferred as legitimate or not if that is emanating from the ranks of the imperialists themselves. Our responsibility is to lay it out as we see it. Our responsibility is to tell the truth. And that basically, as Dan indicated, what we are experiencing is that we live in the middle of what people refer to as the belly of the beast. That this U.S. state represents the main threat to global to human existence on this planet. That they are involved in almost every horrible situation that we find ourselves facing on this planet. And we have to lay it out as we see it. So, this is what it takes to try to, in fact, shift the narrative, to be honest with people, but also in that being honest, also not fall prey to cynicism. You have to make sure people understand that history is made by the people themselves, and that to be sort of abstract, but that these states cannot operate. They cannot operate without some degree of consent from the people. And when we look at, for example, what is happening with the U.S. and where they are funneling our resources, funneling those resources into militarism and war, then our responsibility, it becomes quite clear. We have to resist that and not be concerned about the consequences because it's having a detrimental impact on not only the people in the crosshairs abroad who are attempting to resist, attempting to assert their fundamental human rights, but the same thing is happening here in this country. We are all under the gun of the oligarchy. We all are experiencing the detrimental consequences of a system that is not only clueless, but is dangerous. And in their ability to try, or in their attempt to try to maintain their dominance, all of us are in fact threatened. Neo-fascism is a reality. And people have to understand the context that we are in right now. And if you're not prepared to resist, then at least step to the side and not oppose those of us who are serious about building structures of resistance here in this country and abroad.
great. Thanks for that, Ajamu. And thinking about the role of the U.S., well, hegemonic narratives and the U.S. as the major, global terrorist, I want to bring us back to Jibo Sobukwe's question about the connection between Al-Qaeda in West Africa and the Gulf states in terms of weapon supply or other support. And, this question has been addressed in relation to Syria. I think it would be interesting to make these connections if anyone can, Dan or Ajamu or Bahman, in relation to West Africa as well.
Let's start real quick though, and just in terms of making those connections, and to remind us because these things happening. There's so many things happening so quickly at this historical moment that we have to be reminded that one of the elements that resulted in the lethalness of the Al-Qaeda forces in Africa was in fact the overthrow of the government in Libya. And with these tremendous amounts of weapons that were transferred from Libya across the Sahel and also into Syria. And the fact that not only did you have that cache of weapons that found their way into the arms of people who were who began to identify themselves as Al Qaeda and also ISIS. You had the nefarious activities of states, the Saudis in particular, the UAE, in which they were in fact helping to fund, along with U.S. and Western intelligence agencies, to increase the lethalness of these elements in North Africa and in West Africa, because as Dan pointed out correctly, that these are the foot soldiers of Western imperialism. One day you are a so-called terrorist, the next day you are your hands being shaken and you are being brought into the community of nations. So the same thing is happening in West Africa. That as soon as the people begin to support their leadership in places like Burkina Faso and Niger and Mali, there was an uptick in the activities of these Al Qaeda related forces in those countries, in particular in Burkina Faso. And so it's important that people understand that. It's important that people, going back to this issue of the narrative, that you're not afraid to stand with the people of those nations. Yes, they are military governments at this point, but there are particular reasons why those governments are now are in a military form, and we should not be allowed or not allow ourselves to be intimidated into supporting these attempts to try to transform their societies. So, this is what we have to be aware of: the fact that there is that a terrorist today is a freedom fighter for somebody else, supposedly. So, we're not going to allow this experiment that's developing in West Africa to be undermined by us being intimidated into silence, because they are military governments. We're going to correctly point out the fact that these are governments that are taking back up the mantle of the commitment to a revolutionary Pan-Africanism on the African continent, a Pan-Africanism that's part of the global struggle for national liberation and for global socialism. So, the terms of struggle are quite clear. The only question that many people have to ask for themselves is, are you prepared to, in fact, engage in this struggle, and not allow yourself to be intimidated into silence or complicity?
Excellent. Thank you for that, Ajamu. Really important to uplift the Sahel Alliance and the role these countries are playing materially to challenge the imperialist world order. So really important connections. I want to move on to the next question by Manny Ness. And I'll group two questions together. Manny's question is, what are the consequences of the Western-sponsored overthrow of Bashar al-Assad on the movement for Palestinian liberation? And then connected, can we also answer this question from an anonymous attendee? What about Yemen? What role does it play in the liberation of Palestine? And why have other countries in West Asia not joined its missile strikes into Israel? So, question about Syria and its role now that there's been regime change, and then a question about Yemen and its role in liberation of Palestine and West Asia more broadly.
Yeah, I'll take, well, I can take both, really. In terms of Syria, I think it's clearly a defeat for the Palestinian cause, or a setback, let's put it that way, that Assad was overthrown. And you're seeing this every day. So, first of all, what's happened is the Gilani government is normalizing relations with Israel. It is effectively ceding over territory to Israel. In fact, the new Secretary of the Interior issued a new map. Sorry, I had a call coming in. Do you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. The Secretary of the Interior issued a new map of Syria that did not even include the Golan Heights, effectively ceding the Golan Heights to Israel. Meanwhile, Gilani has been imprisoning Palestinian leaders, leaders from Palestinian groups in Syria, and is now throwing out many of the Palestinian resistance forces, throwing them out of Syria. So that's a huge, so that's pretty blatant how that's a setback for the Palestinians. Of course, the other way it's a setback is that Syria has been a very important pathway from Iran to get weapons and munitions to Hezbollah in Lebanon and then into Gaza. So that is going to be cut off, that pathway. So that's huge. So again, I see it as an unequivocal disaster for the Palestinians. Not one that maybe can't be overcome, but it certainly is a huge setback. In terms of Yemen, Yemen, on the other hand, is unequivocally positive for the Palestinians. They're the one country who is consistently and ceaselessly fighting to defend the people of Palestine. And it's very laudable what they're doing. It's one of the poorest countries in the world that, let's remember, has been victimized by imperialist aggression since 2015 in a very devastating war. And yet they have found the wherewithal to continue to fight on behalf of the Palestinian people. And you ask, why aren't other West Asian countries doing it? Because by and large, they're being governed by quislings of the West. You have Sisi in Egypt, and the King of Jordan, and of course the Gulf states. These are all very closely aligned with Western interests. And that doesn't mean their people are. The people are, very pro-Palestinian, but these governments are operating outside the will of the people. But that's the answer to your question. And again, how did that come to be? Because the nationalists, like Assad, like Nasser in Egypt, have been undermined and opposed by the West in very serious ways, and Gaddafi as well, who was a huge supporter of the Palestinian people. And so was Saddam Hussein. Again, whether you like him or not, he was this big, you see a pattern here. The West has worked tirelessly to get rid of these strong secular leaders who support the Palestinians. And that was, by the way, and again, in this book that I'm writing now, or it's actually pretty much written, that's going to come out on Syria, we talk about the fact that Assad's biggest sin, which led to the Western intervention, was his refusal to concede ground on the Palestinian issue. In 2010, and you can find this online, there's a guy who actually, an American, who was involved in negotiations with Assad at the time. He was offered the olive branch by the U.S. and Israel if he would agree to normalize relations with Israel, if he would agree to give up the lands taken by Israel in 1967, including the Golan Heights and the West Bank in Gaza, and if he stopped arming Palestinian resistance groups. And he refused all those things. And then the war began. So those are the leaders they go after. That's why you don't have leaders left, who, except for the ones in Yemen and in Iran, and Hezbollah, which, is not in executive power, but has some power in Lebanon, That's the story.
Thanks, Dan. And Ajamu or Bahman, either the Syria or Yemen question, and Palestinian liberation.
I would like to add a couple of words from a different angle. The question is not the issue of just isolated countries doing their own thing, like Yemen is doing their own thing. Why doesn't Hezbollah do this? Why doesn't Iran do that? The question is the struggle from the beginning. It was a coordinated struggle. And it was not supposed to be everybody doing the same thing. If the Yemenis use missiles, Iran and Syria and others should. Each one had a role to play in this common struggle that they had. And for that reason, of course, as Dan mentioned, some of the Arab states, it's clear whose side they are on, and we cannot expect from them anything like that. But what was left was Syria and Iran as a state, Lebanon and Houthis as a popular force generally, and responsibilities of a state in this struggle is different generally from a responsibility of a movement. So we have to also understand that the general strategy of the resistance movement, as Ayatollah Khamenei himself clearly stated several times, was and is a long-term strategic war of attrition, not a direct military confrontation, because that is the area that the West is superior. And if we allow this to move in that direction, we're going to be fighting in a field that the enemy prefers. So there are a lot of calculations that go into this picture, and especially given the fact that the global transition to a multipolar world itself, China's strategy is also maintaining peace and going through a peaceful transition rather than allowing this to become a military confrontation at the global level or regional level. So all those factors come into the picture, and we have to look at it from a general strategic point of view and not just as action-reaction point of view that just tit for tat situation. I think that is what the US wants, what the Israelis want, and I think it should be calculated in our strategy.
Thank you, Bahman. That's such an important point about having a broader strategic approach to understanding the different parts, certainly of the axis of resistance. I think we've got maybe time for one more question. And
Before we take that question,
sorry, Ajamu,
Corrina,
go ahead, please.
no, I just want to, before we go to the next subject, I just want to remind people, because I find it very interesting to me that, many of us who understood the critical role of Syria in the Palestinian resistance were labeled Assadists. We recognized that if the government was going to be, if the government was overthrown in Syria, that we would probably result in what we see as reality today. But we were labeled as Assadists. It's also important and interesting to also remember that those same elements, and we're talking about now people on the so-called left in the West, and specifically in the US, who labeled us Assadists, were also some of the same people that applauded the overthrow of the government in Libya. And some of those same elements ended up as card-carrying members of the Ukrainian Solidarity Network. So this kind of rightist orientation among the so-called left in the West, and specifically in the US, is part of the challenge we have to deal with. It's connected to the questions we've been dealing with today in terms of how do we reverse the narrative? How do we build movement? Well, we also have to deal with some internal contradictions, the kind of Eurocentrism that has become so predominant among elements here in the West. And so I just want to just remind people the fact that, there is some ideological consistency among some elements that claim to be part of the left, that are basically, in their true characterization, rightist tendencies, rightist elements.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really crucial point, because we do see a lot, we have seen elements of the so-called left who align, the sort of anti-imperialist left that align themselves consistently with the US State Department position. And you got to ask yourself, how is that a left position? So thank you for raising that. I think that's a really important point. And this brings us to the last question. It's a little bit theoretical. I think it's a really important one. raised by Jeanette Graulau. I would like the panelists to comment on the dialectics of national struggles. National revolutions and liberation struggles continue to be national projects. Such was the lesson of the peasant revolutions of the 20th century. Are we painfully witnessing a similar lesson today in Palestine? And how do we get around this dialectics of national struggles? Anyone like to take that one on?
I would nominate Bahman to take that on. Is the elder Marxist here?
No. Too much for me at this stage. It's a very fundamental question that cannot be answered in any short way, I think. To me, given the global situation, I think the center of the revolutionary struggle has shifted to the global south. And we have to really look at it from that point of view and look at it in terms of how to strengthen the international alliances of global south forces. China is doing a tremendous job in this level. And I think we have to be much more active in, at least people in the United States should look at it as those people as partners with themselves in the struggle for getting rid of imperialism. Imperialism cannot be just removed from U.S. scene without cutting off the tentacles that it has spread throughout the world with 180 military presence in 173 countries of the world, with some 1,000, 2,000 military bases around the world, with all the wars that are pushing manipulations in elections, interferences in internal affairs of countries. So long as they keep doing those things, they have enough strength to suppress any movement inside the country too, and even redirect it toward their own interests. So it is a global struggle, and we have to look at it global struggle if we want to win this battle internally also. It takes an anti-imperialist and internationalist approach, not even a nationalist approach. We cannot solve it. So that's my 2 cents regarding this heavy-duty question.
Great.
And I would concur, and in particular on the issue that Carmen Bauman raised in terms of the national question. That one of the things that endears so many of us to Lenin is his contribution to an understanding of the national question, an understanding that led people to really understand what was in fact developing in the so-called global South and the centrality of those struggles in the global South. People began to really understand theoretically by observing the practice that was unfolding in the global South were fundamental. That the energy, the momentum had in fact as come to the global South. The dialectical relationship between these struggles for national liberation and class are also quite apparent. That basically in the phase of imperialism and what Kwame Nkrumah referred to as the highest stage of imperialism, which is neo-colonialism, could not sustain itself without the active support, the active participation and alignment of the comprador classes in these national territories. So the class struggle and the struggle for national liberation go hand in hand, and that's the dialect that people need to understand, and why it's important that if you understand that, then you would be much more. I think the Western leftists would be much more careful in their analysis of what is unfolding in places like Bolivia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and even Cuba. But in particular places like Peru and Haiti, and that allow themselves to be so easily manipulated in their desire to be critical, to end up on the same side of imperialism over and over again. But part of that, why that happens, is the kind of theoretical understanding, theoretical underdevelopment, if you will, of Western, some elements that call themselves Marxists, but the kind of endemic Eurocentrism and arrogance of some people on the left here in the West, and specifically in the U.S.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Ajamu. And with that, I think we should probably close. It's now 4 p.m. I just want to thank the speakers again for such a really wide-ranging, informative, incisive analysis. I myself learned so much from all of the presentations, and also thank you to all of the audience for excellent questions. And I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to answer all of them. But I think I'm going to say something now, and please correct me if I'm wrong. There was a question about accessing a recording of this webinar, and I'm pretty sure that will be up soon and will be circulated. Would you like to say something about that,
That's a
Matt?
question for our president. Our president.
Yes.
Sorry. This will be posted on the US Peace Council website. I mean, Facebook page. I'm sorry. USPeaceCouncil.org. That is the connection. We have a lot of videos about the same webinars that we have had, and this will be added to it. So on Facebook, US Peace Council. If you search for it, you will find it. Hopefully by tomorrow it will be on.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you for the outstanding moderation, too.
Yeah, you did a great job. You were wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.